Bonjour, this is Jasmine. Thank you so much for stopping to smell the roses on Rue Madame. For those of you who are new to the neighborhood, I am a writer, a storyteller, and a community builder. I write about culture, politics, parenthood, and my life here in France. And I recently uploaded a creative writing short story about a family man, older in life, and it is really about the afterlife, a person choosing his own destiny, and a family dynamic that is called into question when faith and your religious beliefs are put into question. So I really enjoy creating these characters and this story. So feel free to go to the Rue Madame blog and check it out, become a patron, and support this passion project. Thank you to all my patrons. Today, I wanted to talk about something historic and is actually in the headlines today. And it's mostly about my ignorance on the topic about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And how I came to really know about it and inform myself about it over the years, and how I was in the dark for a lot of my life compared to how the French, for example, being in France, and how they talk about Israel and the Jewish community, and how anti-Semitism and the respect for the history is so much different, or to my understanding, or from my personal experience, compared to the United States, and how I was raised knowing about it, learning about it, and being aware of the situation. So how I was raised was in a traditional Black church faith. So whenever Israel and Jerusalem and Jesus was talked about, it was always in a religious perspective and never a political perspective or a historic perspective. And I thought that was limiting. I think that is limiting, because when you only have one slice of a huge pie, you don't really understand the entirety of it. And it came to my attention because, if you're not aware, there has been another clash, another explosion between the two groups in Israel. And there's news about airstrikes and forced evictions in the country, and Israel taking the land, essentially, of an occupied Palestinian state. And all of this is like still a little foreign to me, because again, I never really got the history, not even in school. Like in school, I don't know if I've repressed my school days, but I never really remember talking about this particular part of history. And since we are so insular and we only really focus on our own history, and a lot of people would say that's normal, it's our history, but it really does show you that one particular perspective is valued. Because if you're talking about our history, is that my history? Is that African American history? Or is that just American history through the lens of the victor or the oppressor, if that makes sense? But back to the current conflict, the current news of, for lack of a better word, apartheid in Israel and against the Palestinians. And it wasn't until I came here, and since my husband is a historian not a historian, but he's a history buff. He really is into history, and he values how the past really reflects our present day and how it's important, how it's very telling. It's kind of like following the breadcrumbs, if you will. But in the United States, or the education I received, history wasn't as significant. And since we do have different histories and one isn't as long and robust, it kind of explains that. But it shouldn't prevent us from knowing about other places in the world and other states and countries and governments. So being in the dark politically of even how Israel was even created, it was like, you know what I mean? I know it was until I was in my mid-20s actually that I really understood how Israel is a recent country. It's not even maybe 75 years old or 80 years, you know what I mean? It's relatively new, and it was created after the Second World War. And I'm like, explain that a little more. And I was trying to ask my husband, like, explain exactly, like, they just created a country. Like, just a country that was already inhabited, if you will. Like, there were people there. It was a Muslim country. It was Palestine, and through different accords and agreements, because of the Second War, the Jewish community was coming back incrementally, and eventually there was an agreement within the world powers and different countries that this place in the Middle East would become Israel. So, long story short, since there were people already there, there was an obvious clash, and the solution, or the proposed solutions over the decades, has been a two-party or a two-state solution, which didn't go well, obviously, because from the time Israel was created till now, the Palestinians have essentially been exposed from the country because of these clashes. And what boggles me the most is how Western countries, especially the United States, I'll talk specifically of the United States, I never really heard specific, in-depth, revolutionary news coverage of what's going on there. And I guess it has to do with my age at the time, and me eventually growing up and becoming a political, citizen, and being a voter, and having children, and being more in touch with what's going on in the world, that I've realized that this is happening. But I was really oblivious to it all, honestly. And I think it has to do with our culture and the political ramifications of the United States support for Israel, and their kind of laissez-faire attitude about what happens there, because there has been recent outrage about the crimes, the war crimes, apparently, or alleged war crimes that is happening there, but nothing more. There's no political actions except for more aid and more military support to Israel. But apart from that, there hasn't been any substantial headway at creating a peace agreement between the two groups. And why I mentioned apartheid before is because the minority group, the Palestinians, they are kind of muted in a way, since they don't have the powers that be on their side, and they're of their faith also kind of puts them at a disadvantage, since they don't have an affiliation, I guess, to the United States. And Israel, on the contrary, does, since the United States helped defeat the Nazi regime and kind of liberated the Jewish community, which creates that tie. I guess I would say to read up on it and learn more about it, because that's what I'm constantly doing, honestly, because I'm still unsure of the details. But it kind of reminds me of the movement for Black Lives in the United States, because you have a smaller community, let's call it the Black state, that's inside a bigger country, a bigger established, recognized country, and they're feuding. And just because you are for Black lives doesn't mean you're against your country, because it's your country. So I think that is an issue as well, because the argument is, if you are for the Palestinians, or you have something to say against the violence perpetuated by the state, from the Israeli state, then you're considered bigoted because of that, or anti Israel, or anti-Jewish, or anti their existence, when you're just saying killing shouldn't be, oppression and war crimes and forced evictions and genocide, for lack of a better word, isn't okay. Is not okay. It's actually horrific. And I guess comparing it to Black Lives Matter or the movement for Black Lives kind of puts things in perspective. There is not a comparison, so I'm not necessarily comparing the two or saying that they're exact or anything like that, but just putting in perspective, the underdog, or the oppressed, or the minority in this case, only have their voice. They don't have a military behind them. They don't have the support of first world countries behind them. So they have their voice. They have their hands and their fists and whatever they can pick up behind them. But a lot of unaware individuals kind of push this idea that the Palestinians are terrorists, because they're defending their right to live. They're defending their right to live in a country that they always knew as theirs before the decision after the Second World War to create this country. So it's kind of really touchy, really sensitive, and I think it's important to be up to date, or to get a general base of knowledge, historical knowledge, and political knowledge on the topic, and not just a religious understanding, which I have for a long time. So yeah, that's my whole gist of it. I wanted to talk with my husband about it specifically because his understanding of it, his knowledge, and him growing up understanding what was happening, and also the culture in France about this specific situation is very, very taboo, and I wanted him to give his perspective on it. So that will be for the patrons. So feel free to head over to the Rue Madame blog and become a patron and support this passion project. And if you have any questions, comments, feel free to share your thoughts and like and subscribe, all that jazz. And I think that's it. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.